Apartheid is a word that came into the vocabulary. It started as a word used by the regime that ruled South Africa from 1948 to 94, and it was a description. Apartheid is what it sounds like, apartness or separation, and it described their policy of separating their white minority from the black majority, with the white minority ruling over the black majority in apartheid South Africa. The use of the word Israeli Apartheid is sometimes an analogy, saying that it's like South Africa, but not always. Sometimes, yeah, it feels ever necessary to sort of make this basic statement. Sometimes a word comes into the vocabulary from a specific situation, but then gets defined and generalized. So the word apartheid has been defined several times. 1973 United Nations Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. It's a fairly lengthy definition that I won't read right now. The 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and we have a quote from that on one of these papers that I can't see. And actually a South African legal team did those are the two main legal definitions of the crime of apartheid, which is considered a crime against humanity. A South African legal team in 2009 did a study about whether Israel's practices in the occupied West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem constitute apartheid. And they identified 3 pillars of apartheid, which I'm not going to read out because I can't see them, but they're on these papers here. Any of the definitions boil down to separation and domination. Separation of racial groups, and in this case arguably ethnic groups, but not racial groups, but I think morally it's the same, and domination of one over the other. This is the basics of apartheid, and hopefully people can see these. I'm not going to go point by point on any definition of apartheid. I think talking about the state of Israel's practices is actually more important, whether you call this apartheid or call it some other word. I think the point is the practices themselves. There's tons of history. I'm not going to go into much of it. But I'm going to go into a bit just for the sake of situating us and defining terms. So these slides here are a bit misleading because before 1948 there was never a state in this region, but generally speaking the green is land that was generally under Palestinian control or ownership. The Zionist Movement, that should be the first term I'm going to define. The Zionist Movement is the movement to to create a Jewish state in this land that's, the entirety is a little bit smaller than Lake Winnipeg or a little smaller than Vancouver Island, whichever Canadian metaphor you prefer. The Zionist movement started in the late 19th century by European Jews and was led by European Jews over the first half of the 20th century. One of the things they were trying to do was buy up as much of the land as possible. So the white areas on this map are where they succeeded. It was generally a tremendously unsuccessful attempt. There were other things they were doing, including violence against the indigenous Palestinian population, and also there were wings of the Zionist movement going around garnering support from powerful states like England and later on the United States. This here was a proposal from the United Nations about how to divide the land into 2 states, a Jewish Israeli state and a Palestinian state. The mythology is that the Jews accepted this and the Arabs rejected it. In fact, nobody accepted this proposal, and there are some good reasons why not. I mean, if you just look at this map, which is based on reality, you can see why maybe the Palestinians wouldn't have found this state appealing and the Jews wouldn't have found this state as it was viable. So the State of Israel was founded in 1948 amid a major ethnic cleansing project which went on for about 6 months and left 750,000 of the indigenous Palestinians refugees. And the State of Israel was founded with these borders on most of the land, as you see, with the West Bank over here. It's called the West Bank because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. The West Bank and East Jerusalem were occupied by Jordan, which is on the other side of the river. And the Gaza Strip, which you may have heard about, was occupied by Egypt. That was 1948 to 67. in 1967, Israel occupied these territories. So when we talk about the occupied Palestinian territories, these are the ones that we're talking about. When we talk about Israel or Israel proper, we're talking about the white area here. Incidentally, the bottom or the southern half is mostly desert, and so everything's very close together in the northern half of the country. Occupied. Occupied or occupation is also a legal term. It's not necessarily a crime. There are circumstances where it's accepted that a country will occupy a certain area. So that area, in this case the occupied Palestinian territories, is not part of that country, but the country maintains control over that area and has certain responsibilities to the indigenous population, you know, from protecting their physical safety. And one of the responsibilities is actually, it's illegal for an occupying power to move its own civilian population into the territory it's occupying. And we'll get back to that. Also, occupation is seen as something temporary. At 40-some years, this is the longest running occupation of this kind, I believe, in recorded history, or at least since that word began being used. So, what I'm going to be arguing in this presentation is that the situation of Palestinians is different depending where they are. There are different broad categories of Palestinians, and the situation is different for each of them. But taken together, this is all part of one system, all part of one system of separation and domination. So that loosely there are three categories. There's Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinian. They're often called Israeli Arabs to avoid using the word Palestinian, which might indicate that they have some national rights. There's Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And then there are the refugees, who are the people who were ethnically cleansed in 1948, and their descendants, as well as people ethnically cleansed in 1967. There were 750,000 in 1948 and another 550,000 in 67. There's a lot of overlap between the latter two categories. A lot of refugees do live under Israeli occupation in the West Bank or Gaza. I'm going to start by talking about the West Bank. This is an up-close map of the West Bank. Palestinians in the West Bank are under Israeli military occupation. All those little blue dots are Israeli settlements. So I was saying that that it's illegal for an occupying power to transfer their civilian population into the territory. There are currently between 400,000 and 500,000 Jewish Israeli citizens living illegally in strategically placed illegal settlements inside the West Bank. There are settlements designed to cut the West Bank in half, and I mean, you can see the number of blue dots on that map. There's a division in independent Jewish voices generally between the older members who have more of a sense of humor and the younger members like myself. And so this slide being included is me losing this battle. Those houses are over there on the settlements being sown. So Palestinians in the West Bank are under military occupation. The military controls every detail of their lives. There's this ridiculous system of permits. They need permits for just about everything. They need permits to grow onions. They need permits to grow fruit trees and other crops. They need permits to travel. They need permits to build or expand their houses. 90% of these housing permits are denied. When Israel occupied the territory, they froze the boundaries of all the towns and villages so that they couldn't expand. And they haven't allowed one new Palestinian village or community to be established in the occupied territories since 1967. What this is here is the road system. There's a system of Israeli-only roads. Israelis and Palestinians have different colored license plates. There's a series of Israeli-only roads that connect all of the settlements. Palestinians aren't allowed to use these roads. They're not allowed to cross these roads. There's a story of a former Israeli government minister. She was the Minister of Education, and she was driving down one of these roads and saw a soldier confiscating a Palestinian man's car. So she stopped and asked him what was up, and he explained. And she said, he explained, this is a road for Jews only. And she said, well, why isn't there a sign saying it's for Jews only? He said, one, it's his responsibility to know, and two, quote, do you want us to put up a sign saying this road is for Jews only, and then some anti-Semitic journalist will take a photo and prove to the world that, yes, there is really apartheid here. So this was written about in an article that the former Minister of Education published at the beginning of '06 called, Yes, There Is Apartheid Here. 90% of the applications for people to build new houses or build onto their existing houses are denied. That's one of the main reasons for house demolitions. People may have heard of the activist group Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. The State of Israel has demolished 24,000 Palestinian houses since 1967 in the occupied territories. A few other of the rules that apply to Palestinians: administrative detention. At any time, there's, I think, between 8,000 and 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners being held in Israeli jails. Administrative detention means that they can be held for 6 months at a time without charge or trial. And then at the end of the 6 months, they can renew that. So they can sort of put who they want in jail and keep them there. Over 40% of the Palestinian male population in the West Bank and Gaza has been in prison. Oh, and Israel is a state that practices torture. Palestinians are prosecuted as adults at the age of 12. Jews, more reasonably, are prosecuted as adults at the age of 18. Peaceful protest is illegal for Palestinians who are trying to change public opinion, whether using methods verbally or otherwise. Gatherings of more than 10 people is illegal without a permit. Publication of anything with political content is illegal without a permit. And as of 2008, there were 700 restrictions to movement in this area that's a fifth of the size of Lake Winnipeg. These are checkpoints that you have to cross and present your ID to soldiers, roadblocks, sort of earth mounds that just cut up the ability to travel. So a journey that might have taken half an hour at some point by car would take you half a day. It would take me half a day with my Canadian passport and visa and skin that's this color. For Palestinian people, it might be impossible. And of course, the Jewish Israeli settlers who live in the West Bank can travel freely between the settlements, also between the settlements and Israel proper. These impediments to movement are being replaced by the wall. Here's another one of our humorous moments. There they are with George Bush's roadmap to peace, and the wall cutting through the middle of the road. And Ariel Sharon seems to have the concrete business. I lost a lot of these battles. This is the separation wall, or sometimes called the apartheid wall in East Jerusalem. In some places it is this for scale. There's me standing next to the wall. In the cities generally, it is this garish 10-meter high concrete wall. In the rural areas, it tends to be a fence. And some people, I'm not sure if this is still going on, but at least at the beginning it seemed very relevant to some people to talk about whether this is a wall or no, it's just a fence. And that's, I mean, the fence is in some cases, in some ways even worse. It's an electric fence. Then there's a sand area for footprints. There are these watchtowers that'll shoot at anyone trying to get near it. Then there's a ditch, then there's a road. And it's something like 500 meters wide and just expropriates a huge amount of land. And I mean, the root of it is just ridiculous. This is my uncle, and you can see it snaking around an individual house, and really, it's hard to see how it's not the case that the root is just taking as much Palestinian land as possible. This shows a bit of the root. So, George W. Bush described the wall as snaking in and out of the West Bank. Half of that is true. It snakes into the West Bank. There's never a point where it snakes out. But here it is, it's snaking around to annex these settlement blocks. Next is Gaza. The coastal territory, the Gaza Strip, is a different situation. The wall around Gaza was completed in 1994, at least on these two sides. Gaza borders on Israel on these two sides, and the sea over here, but Israel also controls that border, and Egypt here, which, I mean, we'll see what happens, but but it has been jointly controlled by the State of Israel and Egypt with a pretty obvious common purpose. Gaza did have settlements in it before 2005. There was a small number of settlements with a huge military presence, and those were evacuated in 2005, which some on the left hailed as a victory. But really what happened was, then with no Israeli citizens in there, it left the State of Israel much freer to really make this into a prison, to really put Gaza under siege, which is a word that you'll hear a lot to describe Gaza right now. Gaza is very much under siege, especially since 2007. I mean, Gaza is something like 80% refugees. Most of the people there are unemployed. Most are under the age of 18. Very, very dependent on foreign aid. And in 2007, since 2007, Israel has been letting in about a fifth of the foreign aid that they need. So it's insufficient food, water, medical supplies, fuel, school supplies, building materials. And then at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead. This was a 3.5-week military operation that killed 1,400 Palestinians. The numbers are a little bit vague. It's a little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending whose source you're using. Injured between 5,000 and 6,000, and might have demolished up to 8,000 Palestinian homes in 3.5 weeks. They bombed all kinds of civilian targets. They used weapons that have been banned that are really quite awful weapons. And the siege continues, and they can't get building supplies in there, so they can't repair the damage that was done. Never mind the loss of civilian life. The 1,400 that were killed were mostly civilians, including possibly up to 400 or more than 400 people under the age of 18. East Jerusalem. And East Jerusalem is yet another flashpoint of apartheid and a different situation. Because East Jerusalem was annexed in 1967. The rest of the world doesn't acknowledge this. Israel does. Israel considers this part of Israel. The rest of the world would still consider it occupied. But the Palestinian people, when their land that they were living on was occupied, were not granted citizenship. We got into the details. Some of the details are just so convoluted. We got into the details earlier today that they were offered a chance to become citizens in the early 80s, but this was but then they would lose their claim to being Palestinians and part of a future Palestinian state, which at that point was looking more likely to happen than it is now. There are all kinds. There's Palestinians in East Jerusalem are they're cut off from the rest of the West Bank. There's particularly a few neighborhoods in East Jerusalem where there are evictions happening, both by force and through court orders, ordering people out of their houses so that Jewish settlers can move in. This is part of a process called Judaization, which is part of the mainstream discourse in Israeli discourse. I mean, for reference, I mean, think of how you'd feel if your neighborhood was being whiteified or Christianized. But Judaization is a mainstream part of the discourse. Moving on to Israel proper, because this is, the mythology is that, there's 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinian. They have all these rights, they're citizens. Israel is not a democracy. It's not the state of all its people, it's the sovereign state of the Jewish people. That's in its Declaration of Independence. There are things like the Citizenship Law, which basically, the details of it are so convoluted, but basically if a Palestinian who has citizenship wants to marry a Palestinian non-citizen who lives in the West Bank, that person can't come live with them and get citizenship. The person with citizenship could give it up, but the person without it couldn't get citizenship. Any Jewish person in the world pretty much can get automatic citizenship in the state of Israel through the law of return. 93% of the land of Israel proper is held in trust for the Jewish people. It can't be sold to individuals, Jewish or non-Jewish, but it can't be rented to non-Jews, to Palestinians. Israel has not allowed the creation of one new Palestinian community, I was saying, in the territory since '67. They haven't allowed one new Palestinian community within Israel proper since 1948. The unrecognized villages, I'll talk about briefly because this is a flashpoint of apartheid. The Bedouin is one group of Palestinian people who have Israeli citizenship. About half of the 180,000 Bedouin people live in these unrecognized villages. They don't appear on maps. They don't have paved roads. They don't have sewers or water and sewage. They don't have electricity. A few have some access to education and medical services. Most don't. And all of their buildings are considered illegal. So there's this village called Al-Araqib that they're sort of wood-framed tents that they've set up. And the Israeli military will come in and bulldoze it. And then the Palestinians will put their tents back up. This village has been razed to the ground 21 times. Currently, right now, they have a bulldozer encampment set up because they're bringing the bulldozers in to demolish the tents that frequently. Palestinians are allowed to run for office. They're allowed to run for the Israeli Knesset, which is the parliament. But the some Arabs do sit in the parliament, but the Arab parties were banned by the Central Elections Committee in the 2003 and 2009 elections. They were charged with disloyalty and banned from running. Then they were allowed to run. The Supreme Court overturned that decision. And now with Avigdor Lieberman, who's now the foreign minister, and he ran on an explicitly racist platform of no loyalty, no citizenship, and these loyalty oaths. As well as other discriminatory, he's pushing forward a lot of discriminatory laws. And then there are the refugees, and their situation depends on where they're living. Somewhere between 2 in 5 and 1 in 2 refugees in the world is Palestinian. There are 4.8 million in the Middle East alone. A lot of them are in refugee camps in the West Bank or Gaza, or Lebanon. There are Palestinian refugee camps there as well. Some Palestinian refugees are citizens of other countries and do have rights there and political rights. So the main issue with the refugees is that international law guarantees them the right to return to the homes that they were evicted from. And they haven't been allowed to in 60-some years. Oh, and can't visit. My friend who was born in Gaza really can't go to Gaza to visit his family. And once told me the story of the 3-day ordeal of trying to get there and then eventually being put back on the plane and sent home. I want to talk about this. So it's a lot of information and it's all fairly convoluted. And I wrote an article a few years back, and one of the responses was, well, Mr. Thau-Eleff has to decide, are the Palestinians under occupation, or are they refugees, or are they Israeli citizens? Come on, make up your mind. And I never responded, but I don't. It's a complex situation, and people have different situations depending on this. But what I'm arguing is that it all falls under one, it's all part of the same system. Effectively, between the river and the sea, there's one government, there's one entity, there's one state, and it's the state of Israel. It rules over all these people. Half of them are Jews, half are not, so I wouldn't actually consider that a Jewish state, and certainly not a democracy. The call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which has been very tied to Israeli Apartheid Week, outlines a 3-part goal, which I think is very instructive. The call is for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel as a nonviolent tactic until it fulfills these 3 goals, one of which is end the occupation and colonization, recognize the fundamental rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, full equal citizenship, and the right of return for refugees. And boycott, divestment, sanctions is the focus of a lot of international activism and an international movement right now, and let's hope it makes a difference. Thanks very much.
Here in Manitoba, right here at the University of Winnipeg, The struggle against apartheid is also the struggle to discuss apartheid, a struggle to resist attempts to curb freedom of expression about all things concerning Israel's occupation. I want to talk about this struggle. I want to talk about our ability to discuss Israel and apartheid as an integral part of any discussion that comes under the title of Apartheid 101. This is sort of the effect of apartheid in our own backyard. Last year, a motion was brought forward to the Manitoba legislature to denounce Israeli Apartheid Week. Unfortunately, or fortunately rather, the motion failed, but we fear it actually will be attempted again. A similar motion was passed in the Ontario legislature. Since Israeli Apartheid Week began in 2005, efforts to organize it have been accompanied by efforts from B'nai B'rith and other organizations to pressure universities to refuse to let Israeli Apartheid Week happen. Many tactics have been used. Letters to presidents, public addresses directed at presidents, pressure put on funders, etc. And petty but very effective tactics like not allowing organizers to book rooms or making it very difficult for them to do it. And on some university campuses, at York University in this case this year, actually requiring the organizers to come up with enough money to pay for private security. People don't have that kind of money, so it has the effect of closing down the ability to run Israeli Apartheid Week. Even though there's been no incident either at York or any other university in which there's been any kind of violence or any kind of disruptive behavior that would warrant such security. As recently as last week, B'nai B'rith called on David Bernard, president of the University of Manitoba, and said in their letter, quote, he asked the president to launch a formal investigation into possible violations of the university's policies against violent or threatening behavior that would be in direct contravention of its obligation to provide a respectful work and learning environment. These violations stem from the publicity used to promote Israeli Apartheid Week. President Bernard respectively refused to do so and reminded B'nai B'rith of the sacred importance of free expression in a democratic society and on Canadian university campuses. But the support at other campuses has not always been so principled as it has been here, or at least at the University of Manitoba. If we are going to talk about apartheid, Israel and apartheid on university campuses and elsewhere, which I firmly believe we must be able to do, students and faculty must be prepared to address the claims made by those who are so adamant in their opposition to freedom of expression on this issue. To quote David Matus, senior counsel of B'nai B'rith, the charge of apartheid against Israel is one of a barrage of anti-Zionist accusations leveled against Israel. Anti-Zionism, by definition, is rejection of the existence of the Jewish state. That rejection is the denial of the right of self-determination of the Jewish people. So, the charge that Israel is an apartheid state is connected to anti-Semitism, both in substance and in form. Matus is one voice labeling the notion of Israeli apartheid as a malicious fantasy that seeks to criminalize the Jewish state and thus vilify all Jews. The crux of their argument is that Israel as a Jewish state and that any criticism of Israel amounts to an attack on Jews. Israel and Judaism are fused in this view. Thus, to speak of Israel as an apartheid state is to accuse all Jews of participating in the crime of apartheid. This amounts to what is commonly referred to as the new anti-Semitism. Now, I want to quote something from Tony Jute, a recently deceased, a highly respected Jewish European historian, who published these comments in Haaretz, a leading Israeli newspaper. I want to emphasize that this appeared in a leading Israeli newspaper. Quote, when Israel breaks international law in the occupied territories, when Israel publicly humiliates the subject population whose land it seized, but then responds to its critics with a loud cry of anti-Semitism, it is in effect saying that these acts are not Israeli acts. They are Jewish acts. The occupation is not an Israeli occupation. It is a Jewish occupation. And if you don't like these things, it is because you don't like Jews. Jude is pointing to the all-important core issue. Is Israel a state of all its citizens, or is it an ethnocracy, ruled by one ethnic group over another? Is it Jews who built the separation barrier and encouraged the spread of illegal settlements on occupied land, or did Israel, a political entity, a state amongst other states, a sovereign nation, that is doing these things? Are we, who want to talk about apartheid, criticizing the action of Jews or the action of a state? The answer to this is clear. The struggle against Israeli apartheid is a struggle against the state of Israel and a struggle against ethnocracy. It is not a call to be rid of Israel as a state, but a call to be rid of the ethnocracy that leads to apartheid. Jude tells us that his article received severe criticism, as you can well imagine. The answer to this, but he makes a very important point when he talks about that criticism. He notes that most of the hysterical responses came from the United States, as is so often the matter. Israeli reaction, both critical and supportive, were more restrained. We have to understand this, because it's a crucial observation, one that those who have been active in the apartheid movement or are concerned about the occupation have experienced often. Extremely vitriolic responses appearing in papers like the National Post, in the Sun, in the public presentations. When people talk about things here that, as I'm going to point out in a moment, are freely talked about in Israel. In fact, the question of Israel and apartheid is widely debated in Israel by major political figures and senior academics. There is a desperate fear among many that the conduct of the occupation and its attempt to deal with the millions of Palestinians that came under its authority with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967 is turning the country into the new South Africa. Surprisingly, I think, Ehud Olmert, former Prime Minister of Israel, a very conservative Prime Minister, said, "If the day comes when the two-state solution collapses and we face a South African-style struggle for equal voting rights, also for the Palestinians in the territories, and as soon as that happens, the state of Israel is finished." Olmert's concern were expressed by Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister and currently Minister of Defense in the current Israeli government. As long as in this territory west of the Jordan River there is only one political entity called Israel, it is going to be either non-Jewish or non-democratic. If this bloc of millions of Palestinians cannot vote, that will be an apartheid state. Talmud Aloni, former Israeli Minister of Education under Yitzhak Rabin, wrote, "The U.S. Jewish establishment's onslaught on former President Jimmy Carter is based on him daring to tell the truth, which is known to all. Through its army, the government of Israel practices a brutal form of apartheid in the territory it occupies." And one more, that's one I'm not going to go into, it's a bit long. I could come up with hundreds of these, literally. This is a sample, a small sample. This is Baruch Kimmerling, deceased now, formerly Distinguished Research Professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, and George S. White, professor of sociology, Hebrew University, Jerusalem, arguably one of the most influential Israeli sociologists of the last 20 years. Kimberlin wrote, Israel ceased being a true democratic state and became a Herrenvolk democracy. This term, coined to describe South Africa under apartheid, describes a regime in which one group of its subjects, the citizens, enjoy full rights, and another group, the non-citizens, enjoys none. The laws of Israel have become the laws of a master people, and the morality that of lords of the land. This is a sociologist, very, very respected, well-placed sociologist, publishes extensively. Does this sound like a malicious fantasy to you? David Matus and others claim that it is. If so, do we want to believe that these Israeli politicians and scholars charge about apartheid is connected to anti-Semitism? Does that make any sense? I think it is clear that we can set aside the argument that the discussion about apartheid in Israel is merely the charge of anti-Semites and those who want to see the destruction of the state of Israel. That is most definitely a false claim. The evidence on that is clear. It is propaganda, misinformation, whatever you wish to call it. The question of Israel and apartheid is a serious, legitimate concern inside and outside Israel, and we need to talk about it. The reality is that those who call for the end of Israel as an apartheid state are not calling for the destruction of Israel as a normal state. They are calling for the end of the ethnocracy and the blatant oppressive conditions imposed by that ethnocracy upon Palestinians inside Israel, in the occupied territories, and in the refugee camps. One more point is worth mentioning, and all I can hope to do in the few moments left to me is to introduce you to this point and invite you to explore it in more depth. This is a very, very complex issue that I'm just going to touch upon, but I hope you'll pick up on some of the things I'm saying and we'll explore them further. Can you pass me that?
No, yes.
For part of what I'm going to say, I would actually encourage you to read a book by Yaakov Rabkin called A Threat from Within, A Century of Jewish Opposition to Zionism. Rabkin is a distinguished senior scholar in history at the University of Montreal. Matus argues, go back, that the charge of apartheid against Israel is one of a barrage of anti-Zionist occupations levied against Israel. Anti-Semitism, he says, is by definition a rejection of the existence of the Jewish state, and thus for Matus, as I mentioned earlier, the logic proceeds, the charge that Israel is an apartheid state is connected to Semitism. In a sense, anti-Zionism is equated with anti-Semitism. If you're an anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite. That's what's being argued here. It's quite clear. And in fact, elsewhere in the article that I'm quoting this from, it's actually explicit. The problem with this formulation is it simply isn't true. Not all Jews believe that Israel represents or speaks for them. And those who refuse to be equated with Israel do not appreciate being told we are self-hating Jews and connected to anti-Semitism. In the opening pages of his book, Rabkin, an Orthodox Jew, a very religious Orthodox Jew, I might add, tells the story of a group of Haredim, very pious Orthodox Jews dressed in their black frocks and big wide-brimmed black hats, brandishing placards outside of a celebration on Israel Independence Day in Montreal. The placards read, "Stop Zionism's bloody adventure. The Zionist dream has become a nightmare. Zionism is the opposite of Judaism." In their pamphlet, they wrote, "Worse than the toll of suffering, exploitation, death, and desecration of the Torah has been the inner rot that Zionism has inflicted into the Jewish soul." Those are very, very strong words. In one of many such quotes in Rabkin's book, he provides these words from a Haredim rabbinical scholar. Only blind dogmatism could present Israel as something positive for the Jewish people. Established as a so-called refuge, it has unfailingly, over the past decades, been the most dangerous place on the face of earth for Jews. And let us not forget that to this must be added the suffering of the Palestinian people, a nation condemned to indigence, persecution, to life without shelter, to overwhelming despair, and all too often to premature death. Rabkin points to the Haredim, the significant number of Reformed Jews that have considered themselves anti-Zionist and have consistently resisted the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. That's the key. They are not alone. During the 1930s in Palestine, a small but influential group called Brit Shalom argued fervently against the idea of a Jewish state and sought to create Israel as a binational state. Among its members was one of the greatest Jewish scholars and philosophers of our age, Martin Buber, and the first president of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Judah Magnus. Today we have groups like Jewish Voices for Peace with over 100,000 members in the United States and independent Jewish voices here in Canada that essentially carry this tradition of resistance to being labeled as supporters of Israel carte blanche. As Matus does, do we label the Haredim, Magnus, Buber, and all those who oppose Israel as a Jewish state, self-hating Jews connected to anti-Semitism? The claim is simply ridiculous. It works only because those who want to shut down discussion of Israel and apartheid categorically refuse to discuss the wide range of views on Zionism in Israel. They have created an us versus them mentality. Either you give unqualified support to Israel or you are connected to anti-Semitism. There can be no middle ground. The existence of an enormous middle ground, indeed the existence of extreme disagreements about that position, has been completely obliterated from the discussions that you will read about in any of the major media and that you certainly will read about in the articles that are written by people coming out of B'nai B'rith, Matus himself included. Nowhere, not one place in Matus's article that I'm quoting from does he cite any of the individuals, Israeli politicians and scholars that I have mentioned, or would even lead you to believe that these people exist. Democracy cannot tolerate an ethnocracy. This is true whether we are concerned with Hindu nationalists in India, extreme Islam, other forms of extremism in Asia or in North America. If an ethnocracy is wrong in Iran, it is wrong in Egypt, it is wrong in France, it is wrong in Indonesia, and it is wrong in Israel. There are no exceptions. There are no alternatives. Ethnocracy is preserved only through ethnic cleansing and apartheid. If you voice your dissent, you are not calling for the destruction of Israel. I want to emphasize that. You are calling on Israel to conduct itself as a nation amongst nations. You are calling it to respect the human rights of Palestinians, to end an occupation that is leading to the recreation of the South African-style Bantustans. You are calling for the end of the horrific humiliation of people whose land Israel has seized. You are valuing the humanity of Palestinians as you value all human life. No exceptions, no special considerations. It's either democracy for us all or it's no democracy at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of the panelists, and now the floor is open, please.
So pre-1948, when those few settlements were being set up, why wasn't there sort of concerted effort by the people to, resist militarily or otherwise settlements from being placed?
Well, I mean, here's an important, like, I feel like I've been in so many arguments over the years, and, you know, people have said, well, actually Golda Meir, who was the third or fourth prime minister of the state of Israel, has a famous quote of saying, there was no Palestinian people living in Palestine considering itself a Palestinian people. They did not exist. There's also a famous quote, a famous sort of Zionist ideal, a land without people for a people without a land. There were no countries in Africa before 1885 when 6 European powers sat down and carved it up. The Middle East very similarly. France and England, I want this part, they divided it into zones of influence. I mean, Palestine was always under one empire or another. They were under the Ottoman Empire for a long time, but they, you know, it's kind of like a really big federal government with no provincial government or something like that. Like, they were under the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire wouldn't have been able to exert control in the same way that, well, certainly that being under Israeli occupation, or I mean, it was under the Ottomans, and then later it was under the British Empire. It was one of the British zones of influence. In terms of efforts to resist, I mean, there's a long history. There were efforts to resist, some of them valid, some of them not. I mean, the thing is, there were always 10,000 Jews living in this land. A friend of a friend is something like an 8th generation Israeli, Jewish 8th generation Israeli. There aren't many. But those, you know, they were not Zionists. They wouldn't have seen it, having a Jewish state there as any more realistic or desirable than we might see having a Jewish state in Manitoba. So there is that history of coexistence and cooperation. People will try to deny that history. It's not politically convenient if you want to believe that these Palestinians always hate us and never will accept us, and the only solution is to pen them in and deprive them of all basic rights. But that's the history. There were Palestinian leaders who thought that the Jews were moving in and trying to set up a Jewish state and expel them, and there was resistance. I mean, it's actually that in the 1930s, 1936 to 39, there were what's known as, the Arab Riots? Is that the Arab Revolt? Thank you. That was the Arabs resisting this, and the British just crushed it. And actually, that's one of the reasons that the victory, or that the state of Israel was able to capture so much land and expel or ethnically cleanse so many people in 1948, is that 10 years earlier, all the most competent fighters and leaders had been killed or imprisoned.
You talked about boycotting them as a peaceful solution. I'm all for a peaceful solution. But the reality is that Israel is backed by America, and everyone in the world could boycott them, but it wouldn't make any difference.
You know, when you make that comment, it's very reminiscent of, I was very active in the boycott movement against South Africa. And I can't recall how many times people said, you know, this isn't going to make any difference. South Africa is supported by the United States, it's supported by Britain, it's supported by most European powers. People are heavily invested in South Africa. There's an enormous amount of corporate investment in South Africa. The boycott won't do anything. You're spinning in the breeze. He said two things. One is, well, what else can we do? I mean, we can demonstrate, we can walk around, but people have been demonstrating and walking around for 60 years, and not 1 inch of the occupied territories has been returned to the Palestinians, not 1 inch. Boycott has a very powerful moral message. It has a very important educational message. It's much more than just the actual boycotting of goods. It gets people to talk about it. It creates a framework, and it is a specific kind of action. What is its impact? That's always a really good question. We know, actually, it wasn't a decisive influence in the fall of apartheid in South Africa, not by a long shot. But it was, in fact, an influence, an important influence. And one way it was a very important influence came to me because I have relatives from South Africa. And in speaking with them, they said, you know, the real problem for us was, these are academics, the real problem for us was that you couldn't travel anywhere in the world. You couldn't go to any academic conferences. You couldn't do anything without people coming up to you, either before or after and during the presentations, and wanting to talk about boycott, and wanting to talk about South Africa, and wanting to talk about apartheid. It could be presenting papers on scientific topics, had no relationship to the issue at all. And yet that was the topic that was brought up. It got to the point that it was even difficult for academics to want to participate in these kind of events. And cultural activities, it was the same thing. So it was more that there was a shift in the mentality of people in the rest of the world. And that had an enormous impact upon cultural workers, academics, and I'd say generally the middle class in South Africa. And that ultimately had a great deal of influence on the stability of the apartheid regime, and that contributed a great deal to the ultimate undermining of that regime. So I know what you're saying, and I appreciate what you're saying, and often you can feel really like, gee, how could this ever have such an effect? But one way that you know it has an effect is by the incredible response and reaction that happens when a trade union, and there are many of them, have passed boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolutions. When the United Church of Canada actually considered such a resolution at its conference in Kelowna, I guess a year or so ago, literally, I guess it's appropriate, all hell broke loose against the church. That has happened when, I think some of you heard that when the Bay actually canceled one of its cosmetic products. It's made in the West Bank, what's called Aviva. The Bay was so heavily criticized because they were accused of bowing to boycott pressure. In fact, it was a business decision. But the owners of the Bay found out that you can conduct business normally in terms of what you buy and sell on every other product in their department store. But issues that have to do with Israel, somehow they're supposed to ignore the bottom line and bring in the product even though it's losing money because there's a pressure group in Canada that thinks they should do that. The Bay refused. Business is business for the Bay. So these are the ways in which the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement have a powerful impact. And it's a nonviolent international approach to being able to deal with the issue.
I got the woman back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear, perhaps give another response to the question over here about what good can these things do. And I think even apart from the boycott, divestment, sanctions, which I totally support, even just calling this Israeli apartheid, I think that's an amazingly powerful term because South African apartheid has been so universally discredited, and it's why nobody, people who are against this are so vehement about not announcing these. Why did I not get an announcement this talk was happening, from the university? That word is powerful, and if you can make that kind of analogy and convince people, it's not very hard when you hear a few facts, and it's amazing. I think how the moral tide can turn as well. So.
It has. One of the big things is Jeff Halper was here quite a few years ago, and one of the things that Jeff said in his presentation, who's the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, well-known anti-occupation activist in Israel. He talked about changing the frame of debate and discussion. And at the time that he was speaking, mostly what you would find in presentations like this is that people were talking about, it was the Palestinians we talked about. We were always talking about the Palestinians. And I think what's a real change that has happened in the last couple of years is that we're not really talking about the Palestinians so much anymore. What we're talking about is we're not talking about the occupied. I mean, we're talking about the way in which Daniel describes what these people are experiencing. But the apartheid issue shifts the debate and the discussion where it belongs, and that is to talk about the occupying power, about those who are occupying the country. What are they doing? What impact is it having on their society? Something we haven't even gone into today. Yeah, that's just the point. It's really shifted the discussion. It's reframed the debate, and it's a very, very important reframing, because now we can talk about what really matters, which is the occupier, and not be putting so much of our attention on the politics of the occupied, or whether they're doing this right or whether they're doing that right.
Yeah, I would say participating in the discourse and organizing, get involved with Students Against Israeli Apartheid. I think it is very significant for these events to happen on campus. And if we can build these events in strength and numbers, then eventually working towards more concrete action on boycott, divestment, sanctions at the university level, I think could potentially be a very powerful thing.
When you are involved in this issue, beyond just taking the bumps and from being accused, you do have to prepare yourself in another way. You have to prepare yourself in terms of thinking about how you are going to respond to accusations about anti-Semitism. How are you going to respond to the question that you simply hate Israel? How do you answer the question, why are you concerned about this issue? There's a really key question. Why are you concerned? Why do you care about this? Why does it matter to you? Does it matter to you because it's a humanitarian crisis? The reality is, that for all the misery that we've talked about and we've demonstrated on the screen, the Palestinian experience is not the worst humanitarian disaster in the world. Things that have been going on in Africa, in Asia, Bangladesh, and elsewhere are absolutely horrific. So being able to say simply that, this is a humanitarian crisis and I want to respond to it, it's not enough. You have to be able to do better than that. And one of the reasons that you have to be able to do better than that is because the people who are going to be your opponents that you're going to reach can very often answer that question very easily. They will say because they care very, very much about Israel, because they are committed to it, because they see a commitment to Israel as a way to stand up against a history of atrocities and persecution. In a sense, what I'm saying is that many people find it very easy to answer that question. They know the answer to that question. And we find actually that people who are resisting the Israeli occupation sometimes have a very difficult time being able to answer that question to themselves, let alone being able to answer that question to others. So I really encourage you to be able to think through these issues, to pursue and listen and read about other people who have tried or have had to answer this question. You don't have to make this up yourself. You can really go in and find some of this information. I've tried to show you a few people, a few articles. I can tell you other things that you can read. It's very, very important. And it will really arm you, to use that expression. I hate military things. It will prepare you to really be able to sustain a struggle against Israeli apartheid and against the occupation, instead of finding that you were just terribly embarrassed one night when somebody said to you, why are you in this struggle? You couldn't really answer the question, and the next day your heart just kind of went out from the effort. You got to keep your heart in there, and one way is you got to get your brain to take care of your heart. So I'll close on that.
Thank you so much.